los temas de seguridad y migración.
Algunos de los énfasis de la relación México-Estados Unidos.
Democracia, lucha contra la corrupción y derechos humanos.
Protección humanitaria frente a la migración.
El sentido de frontera de Estados Unidos.
La cuarta parte de los inmigrantes en Estados Unidos son de origen mexicano.
When you know down inside that I really do, and it's me you need to show. How deep is your love? Is your love? How deep is your love? I really need to learn, 'cause we're living in a world of fools, breaking us down when they all should let us be. We belong to you and me. I believe in you. How deep's your love? How deep?
Hello, can you hear me? Hello.
Hello. Escuchamos perfecto.
Okay, I guess we shall.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Let me open the video. Good morning. Oh my God. I can.
¿Está Claudia?
Is Claudia there?
Okay, I can. Claudia's having technical difficulties. I can take it from here. My name is Joseph Coleman. I'm a professor of journalism at. Oh, hello, Claudia. Okay, some of the inevitable hiccups of doing everything on Zoom. Claudia.
Hola, Joseph. ¿Qué tal?
Hi, Joseph. How are you doing?
Do you want to talk and then I'll go?
Claudia, ¿me escuchan?
Sí.
Claudia, can you hear me there? Yes, here we are.
Blackout. I cannot see myself. El hospedador no deja que se abra mi video.
The host is not allowing me to activate my video. Who's talking? She's Dr. Silvia Núñez. Okay, in 1 minute I will just introduce everyone. I think that she's having trouble turning on her microphone and her camera. Have we started yet? Claudia, can you hear me there? Yes. So she's saying that the host is not allowing me to open my mic or my video. Lucero, can you help us with this?
We want to go ahead and introduce the panel and welcome everyone, and then we have all the panelists join.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, while we're working on the technical difficulties, I will introduce all the panelists and hopefully by then, because there are 4, by the time I'm done with that, we'll probably have ironed out the technical difficulties. So once again, my name is Joe Coleman. I'm a professor of practice of journalism at Indiana University. And welcome to the second panel of the day, which will focus on immigration and journalism. I'm really pleased to have a great panel of journalists, photographers, and academics to discuss how they do their work and what are some of the important things to keep in mind when covering such an important and delicate issue. Let me start with the format for this will be slightly different. For those of you who joined us for the first panel, The format's going to be a little bit different this time. I will introduce all the panelists, and then each panelist will take 10 or 15 minutes, however long they need, to make a presentation. And then once everybody has had a chance to do their individual presentations, we'll bring the group together and go through some of the Q&A. Once again, if you've got questions, use that Q&A button to get them to us in the quickest way possible. The chat button is primarily just for comments that you want to make, not necessarily questions. All right, let's get started. Silvia Nunez Garcia is the director of UNAM at Los Angeles. She led the UNAM North America Research Center from 2009 into 2017, and she herself was a researcher there. She's been recognized as a research associate at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Michigan State University, and carried out research at prestigious universities such as Georgetown University and Nehru University in New Delhi, India. Likewise, she was distinguished as a fellow of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in the United States in 1999. She's done postgraduate studies in sociology at the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences at UNAM. She's a member of the following organizations: so the Board of Directors of the Metropolis International Network, of the Advisory Board of the Mexico Institute of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars of the United States, and the Advisory Council of the North American Research Partnership. Alfredo Corchado Jimenez is an award-winning Mexican-American journalist and author who has covered Mexico for many years. He's been with the Dallas Morning News since the mid-90s and specializes in covering the drug wars and the U.S.-Mexico border. Corchado is a graduate of the University of Texas at El Paso, and he was a 2009 Nieman Fellow at Harvard. He's won awards for his courageous reporting, including the Maria Moores Cabot Award from Columbia Journalism School in 2007 for extraordinary bravery and enterprise. He is the author of two tremendous books. His first was Midnight in Mexico, a reporter's journey through a country's descent into darkness. And in 2018, he published Homelands, Four Friends, Two Countries, and the Fate of the Great Mexican-American Migration. Next, we have John Moore, former colleague of mine at Associated Press. He is now senior staff photographer and special correspondent for Getty Images. He's photographed in 65 countries on 6 continents and was posted internationally for 17 years. He returned to the United States in 2008 and has focused on immigration and border issues since. He's won top awards throughout his career, including the 2005 Pulitzer Prize for breaking news photography. In 2018, he published his own book, Undocumented: Immigration and the Militarization of the United States-Mexico Border. The photographs collected in that book represented 10 years of his work along the border and connected to the issues of migration and border security in the United States. Moore is a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. Finally, Cal Sidenio is a journalist of the Costa Chica of Guerrero. He was a reporter for the newspaper El Sur de Acapulco and La Jornada Guerrero, and announcer of the bilingual program Tati Sabi, which translates as Voice of Rain, on Radio y Televisión de Guerrero and Radio Universidad Autónoma de Guerrero, XEIJAG. He, in the Tuansabi language. He is currently a reporter for the Trinchera Seminary. And so let's, if Silvia's technical difficulties are resolved, then we'll start with you. You can go ahead and make your presentation. Thank you, Silvia.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. I really hope that everybody is able to see me and to hear me. I'm so delighted that it seems that I am the only woman that is going to participate in this very relevant conversation. let me just mention that I'm not a journalist. I'm a sociologist, but of course I've been following migration since many years ago, and I am now, for the first time in my life, a migrant because I just moved to the US for working reasons. And I'm just going to turn back to my mother language, which it is still Spanish. Maybe one day will be Chinese, we don't know. But I would like to tell a little bit about my own story, because I had the opportunity to work with a very prestigious group of US academics that in fact one of them is the head of the journalism school at Michigan State University, Professor Manuel Chavez, and an anthropologist, Professor Scott Whiteford from the University of Arizona. They invited me to write a book that is called Uncharted Terrains, New Directions in Border Research Methodology, Ethics, and Practices. And we together wrote an article that deals with shaping public opinion on migration in Mexico. Quisiera mencionarlo porque obviamente...
I would like to bring this up because obviously this is a forum that is mainly addressed to UNAM and University of Indiana students.
It is a must in order for understand such complexity of migration. And so we did this joint research, Mexico and US scholars.
What we intended to do was basically to analyze how immigration was addressed in the Mexican press. We must understand that the press is not only, let's say, somehow creating and molding and shaping the public opinion and public policy. It also impacts on the decision of voters when they go to the ballot boxes. That is one of the main things that we have noticed during these times. These are very significant, and for that reason, journalists are very accountable and they are very responsible for what they tell the public in their reports and articles, because we know that they are addressing a very important topic, that in some way it is very important because it is an unfinished part of globalization, and that is a subject related to, let's say, unregulated or ungoverned human mobility. We know that this is a very important point of, let's say, stress between the US and Mexico. This is a two-sided and two-folded topic for both countries. It is evident that the higher level of concentration of Mexicans and migrants in the US, for instance, we know that perceptions tend to be more polarized. What do I mean with this? Well, that they could also be recognized as very productive persons with great capacities to just somehow become part of the US society. But in some other sectors, they may also be considered as, let's say, lawbreakers and some persons who are reluctant to just be subject to them. So right now, it is important to speak a second language. That is a decisive subject that is not explored or addressed in the media hubs. So right now, this is how we need to start just really addressing these circumstances that are really positive, promoting the language acquisition, not only for new persons who come from a country to another country, just like in the case of the US, we know that learning Spanish, it's not going to build bridges. It is not going to bridge communication, but we know that those who are bilingual in the US have a higher opportunity to get a nice job. So in Mexico, what we noticed is the fact that Mexican rural communities, well, in that case, migrants were the only way out of poverty, and now we found another perception where migrants have been seen at many times in Mexico as quitters. And many times we have heard this by Dr. Douglas Mexi, who has been working systematically with immigration in the US. So I would like to tell you that even though this analysis was published in 2014, when you start just readdressing all of this, you're going to understand that many things have not changed in the past, and that there are many angles that have been already addressed, and that could have just somehow become a little bit raw. We have noticed that when we had Donald Trump as the president, we have mainly focused on immigration and undocumented immigrants as a threat. So along and throughout this article, we address this phenomenon starting in 1990, where we find that as of that time, the media hubs in the US start to address immigration more frequently, and more importantly, they focus on when the White House or the Congress of the US somehow had a special positioning concerning this immigration subject. And then we came to a point in this story related to this immigration, where in 2000 it was very interesting to bear in mind and remember that the governments of these two countries were in some point in time that we would even call a honeymoon. They were now, the president Vicente Fox was the president of Mexico, and he was trying to find a way to amend the immigration laws in order to just really help the millions of undocumented persons who were at the time in the US. Unfortunately, in 2000, we were in a point where we were highly optimistic, and we know what happened in September 11 or 9/11. And that's exactly when we came to this turning point where we realized that, of course, immigration policies became more and more important. So we are going to analyze 4 journals in my country. These are journals Universal, Jornada, El Financiero, and somehow what we were aiming to do was to address 3 main questions. One of them was related to one of the key subjects that were addressed, which were the key subjects addressed in these journals concerning Mexico and the US. The second question was, what was the framework used by the Mexican press to report in my country, well, this subject of immigration to the US? And thirdly, we needed to try to find the positions or the, let's say, the subjects and topics that were mainly addressed by the press when it came to immigration to the US. And we found that the main subjects that were addressed, for instance, in Universal, were immigration and family, the US policies concerning this subject, and also with stressing on the labor market particularly. And what happened with Reforma journal, they were addressing border security, violence, cooperation between these two governments, and the US policy concerning migrants. And as for La Jornada, they were also focusing on family and immigration and remittances as well, and their relationship with families, and also in terms of violence and border security. So I would like to tell you something that I believe to be highly relevant right now, and that is the fact that you are the experts. You may have this information already. A lot of persons do not read, let's say, these traditional media hubs. They don't read, let's say, the largest media hubs, just like the journals that I just mentioned, or news and broadcasters, or anything of the like, where people is mainly depending on the social media, that's where a revolution came along. We know that internet has somehow changed the way we communicate. This explosion of social media has had a significant impact on people, the society, communities overall. And right here, whenever we talk about borders and immigration, that entails addressing international relations. And we may say that in the social media, we have also empowered citizens. At the same time, we have put diplomatics and politicians at risk because they're consistently just being under the public eye in, well, some extents that were not like that in the past. And also we know that internet and other IT technologies are no longer a peripheral force that has an impact on the behavior of the world scenario. It is also a driver of change, and the main driver of this change has to do with the capacity of just spreading and disseminating information to the public in an unprecedented way. Right now, the cost to distribute, store, or record information have also significantly dropped. And also the number of bloggers, citizen journalists as well have increased, just like online activists. They are increasingly more and more. And well, you are the experts, so you will tell how this works in this After Truth time. And well, I'm running out of time, so I would like to be very brief and start with this conclusion on what I just mentioned. The main subject of this forum that was being organized by the School of Sciences of the University of Indiana is a success that leads us to address this subject from the perspective of two countries. And also we have some joint curricula that are of the utmost importance for us to be able to understand the policies in Mexico and the US, because we know that the need of highlighting human factor and the advocacy for human rights becomes absolutely important. Well, this is the importance of this, and we know that both countries are mutually accountable. And 1 in 10 Mexicans, let's say 12 million Mexicans, were born in Mexico and now currently live in the US. So the question that we still have to raise is, what would be the future for the almost 5 million Mexicans who are undocumented and who are living in the US? The role of the mass media and the social media are key under any scenario, because these are the ones who end up just somehow framing this discussion and public debate. From my standpoint, the challenges are multiple in these relationships. And also, we know that the criteria to establish this relationship are absolutely key. For that reason, we are based on many pillars. The very first one is political will. 2, trust and dialogue. 3, deepening on mutual knowledge. 4, organization between stakeholders. And 5, multiplication of transnational stakeholders, and also building regional leadership. Moreover, the creation and strengthening of regional institutions for the advocacy of human rights. I appreciate your attention.
Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias, profesora.
Some important issues that I hope we'll have a chance to sort of explore a little bit more in detail as we go through the time we have here together. The idea about focusing on how immigration is covered in Mexico is really quite compelling, and I'm be interested in hearing more about that and the differences among the media that you were looking at. Social media, again, is something that will probably resonate throughout the time we have together today, and the way that the media shapes opinions, ideas, and even policy concerning this issue. Really, really important stuff. So thank you for that. I'd like to move on to Alfredo Corchado. It's all you, the microphone is yours, Alfredo.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Claudia. I also want to thank UNAM and Indiana University for this this conference. I mean, I think it's very important as a journalist who's lived in Mexico and lived in the United States, the importance of understanding one another, of sort of allowing journalism to be a bridge of understanding, if you will. I'd like to maybe touch on 3 points. My approach to the story of immigration, the approach to the border on a personal level and on a professional level, and then maybe bring up the situation today, the stories that we're seeing these days, and how that story of a kid who grew up in Mexico, immigrated to the United States, how that story kind of resonates in today's journalism, if you will. And then I'll finish up with some of the challenges that we face as journalists, some of the ethical challenges, and how words really have consequences in more ways than one. It's interesting to say that the border is more than a geographical place. It is a mindset. I work for the Dallas Morning News. The paper's based in Dallas, North Texas. I work between Mexico City and El Paso. Pre-pandemic, most of my time was in Mexico City, covering Latin America, covering the country. And I went from the point where most of the immigration was really Mexico-driven, Mexico-based. Many of them individuals who would come to work, and it was to the point where all the infrastructure that we see on the border was really made for the individual Mexican, in more cases Mexican males than women, to then what we see today as more family oriented, coming from Central America, and lately increasingly more from South America, from Ecuador. We're seeing a lot of Peruvians and obviously a lot of Brazilians lately. But my story is basically, I'm a journalist, but I'm also an immigrant. I was born in a place in Durango, Mexico, and we never thought of really immigrating to the United States. I mean, that was a thought that really scared us as children, whenever the idea that we would someday immigrate north. And we did it because my father was a bracero, a worker. In 1942, during the Roosevelt administration, he was able to bring in guest workers to help the United States, because most of the men were off in war. And throughout between 1942 and 1964, there was something like 5 million contracts that were awarded to Mexicans to come help in the U.S., whether it was the fields, poultry plants, meat packing industry. My father came to work first in West Texas, Arizona, and later in the San Joaquin Valley. I came to this country at the age of 6, grew up in California, and then later came to El Paso. But the reason why we came was because my father had basically had enough of working in the United States. He wanted to go home. He wanted to go back and start his maybe a little business, have a little store for us. But there was also the pull of the United States. There was a pull of, the sense that there were jobs throughout the year. And when the employer found out that he was actually thinking of leaving, he offered my father legalization. This was 1965. You had a new Immigration Act, and the employer said, why don't you bring the entire family? And as a kid living in Mexico, I mean, that was the thing that we didn't want to face. I mean, we loved being in Mexico. We loved going to the post office every 2 weeks to get the check from my father. I mean, it was remittances. We had our own little grocery store. It was pretty much an idyllic life for us. So the idea of leaving for another country was just really heartbreaking. And I say that because I see that today as I'm interviewing people. I mean, the idea that Americans have that Latin Americans, Central Americans, Mexicans are just dying to leave their home, I think is a false one, if not an exaggerated one. I mean, I've yet to meet an immigrant who tells me, I was so looking forward to leaving my community. I mean, people come out of need, people come out of poverty or violence, and more importantly, people come out of because they want to be reunited with family. We were some of the lucky ones in Durango who came because, again, my father was able to secure us a green card. But after that, I mean, it basically set off an entire network of family members, of friends back from Durango who wanted to come and reunite with their family and friends back in the north, in California and in Texas. And it was also the idea that, things are better off in the United States, but also we want to be with our cousins. We want to be with my brother. I think my father had, for example, had like a little, a band that they used to play in Durango, all brothers. The name of the band was Carlos Pajaritos, and they all ended up becoming bracero workers. They all ended up in the United States. Their sons ended up having their own musical a group there. But these issues, as I'm interviewing people today, I mean, they really resonate for me as a child to what I see today as a reporter covering this story. And just to give you a sense of some of the stories that we've been covering today, I mean, Joseph mentioned Midnight in Mexico and Homelands. And Midnight in Mexico is more of the book of the kid who goes back to his country, the country that really he yearned for, he longed for. Whereas Homelands is more about El México de acá, the Mexico within the United States. But there are two themes that sort of come together, and they come together with me as a journalist. And that's seeing Central America, seeing Mexico as a country of enablers, if you will. I mean, they are the enablers for the United States charade. The United States, will usually blame Mexico and Latin America for the corruption, for this and for that. But it's a charade because the demand for drugs, the demand for workers has historically been north of the border. I mean, it is, there is a reason why people in Sinaloa, people in Tamaulipas, people in other parts of the country, in Jalisco, there's a reason why, you have these big, powerful cartel operations that in some parts of Mexico, I mean, they basically rule the communities to the point where you have communities of silence, where it's very deadly to be a journalist. And then you also have the service industry, the construction industry in the United States that wouldn't survive if they didn't have the labor that comes from Mexico, the labor that comes from other parts of Latin America. So one of the things I've done in the last couple of years, I try to, as a journalist, try to follow the experience of an immigrant. And for the last 2 years, I've been following this Guatemalteco by the name of Carlos Joaquin, who has allowed me to kind of document his experience coming from Guatemala through Mexico, came to the United States, what's his son, I think at the time, I think he was 9, young kid by the name of Fernando. And it's giving me all this kind of access to try to better explain to the United States, the conditions that these people came and the dilemmas that they face day to day. Came 2 years ago when El Paso and the border basically became kind of a theater, if you will, a political theater for politicians back in DC. You hit the piñata And the harder you hit it, the more political points politicians score. Carlos Joaquin and his son came. They were, I think, for about a week. They were under a tent underneath the International Bridge, under some of the most horrible conditions. And we were able to connect during our first meeting. And to my luck, he was on his way to North Texas. So we've been able to kind of stay in touch during this time. And I've been able to kind of chronicle his experiences. He came from, went from the smugglers really lied to us. And I think it's very important. I mean, let me just pause there for a second. I mean, the role of the smugglers today is so key and so important in what is happening with immigration today. I mean, back when I was a kid, I mean, the smuggler was usually someone we knew, a neighborhood person, someone that maybe my father knew or his brothers. I mean, there was a sense of accountability that if you were going to the United States, we knew who the person was that we were, that our relatives were coming with. In immigration today, I mean, with the use, and Silvia talked about this, touched a little about this, the role of social media is so important. I mean, Carlos Joaquin, for example, talks about how the smugglers were able to show him videos and from Facebook, Instagram, even TikTok, showing them how easy it was to cross the border, showing how easy it was to even cross over the wall, the fence. So, as a journalist, I mean, it's really fascinating to watch how these immigrants become really sucked into this this narrative that really doesn't exist. Just how easy it is. And I remember that the very first meeting I had with Carlos Joaquin and his son, they were just devastated. They said, we have gone through hell. We have spent thousands of dollars getting across from Guatemala through Mexico, and now to at the time when I was interviewing, they were in El Paso, but they had spent something like $6,000. It went up to $8,000 by the time they got to North Texas. But how that money, I mean, they went into debt where they put their ranch. They had to go to a bank to get a bank loan. And you see the story, and it's so common among so many Latin Americans, I mean, Central Americans and people in Ecuador, et cetera. But it's a story that kind of makes you understand that it's not really solely their decision. There are other people who are driving this onslaught of migrants coming north. And then I just, getting to some of the challenges, some of the ethical questions that we face. But one of the biggest challenges I think we all face as journalists is trying to put this issue in historical context. It's happening all the time. And I think sometimes as journalists, we write a story without reminding the reader, reminding in this case, the American reader, how none of this is really new. I mean, this has been happening for generations. And more recently, the challenges that we see on the border today were happening under President Obama, President Trump, and now President Biden. And as we start the year this year, after the Biden inauguration, I mean, everything I was reading was like, this is something that's brand new. So it's always important to give the reader a little context, even though in journalism, it's the first draft of history. Oftentimes we don't have that space or the luxury to give our readers, more of a sense that this has been happening for a long time. But I think at a time when the issue is so divisive and there's so much tension, I think we do our readers a disservice by not reminding them that kids were separated under President Obama and then under President Trump under different circumstances, and that some of these issues we're seeing today. I mean, the spike that we've seen in the last few weeks, similar to 2019, although the numbers today are larger, but it's a seasonal thing. It's a cyclical thing. And I think also when we're dealing with young children, one of the biggest ethical dilemmas that we face is, how do we protect these children? Not just the children, but also their parents, because they're in such, they're some of the most vulnerable people you're going to meet. And oftentimes you have to find a way to also protect them. Sometimes when I'm talking to them, I keep trying to remind them I'm a journalist. I'm a journalist because they might start asking me for legal advice or something that's really, or maybe because I speak Spanish, maybe because I'm the only person there that will speak Spanish to them. They feel this cierta confianza that you have to kind of remind them again, I'm a journalist and I don't want to do anything to first put your family at risk back in Central America, because anything they read will be translated to Spanish at the Dallas Morning and at other major papers, and it'll be on the web, and your story will get out there. So you have to protect them, just like when I was covering the drug war. I mean, always protecting your sources, because they stay behind in Tamaulipas. I may go back to Texas or other parts of the United States, but they're there, they're home, and also try to protect them from their own smugglers. These are big operations that oftentimes work in cahoots with drug cartels. So that's something that's really important for me personally to try to do. And then I'll leave it with this. I mean, the other dilemma that I always face is language. The kind of language that we use to describe a situation. Because we've learned that words really have consequences. And we learned that, no better example and no sadder, more tragic example than what happened in El Paso, August the 3rd, 2019, when you had a 20-year-old who came from North Texas, drove 10 miles, drove 10 hours, 700 miles, to, in his words, stop the Hispanic invasion of Texas. And it's clear that this kid, young man, did not know the history of the United States and Mexico. The fact that the Southwest once belonged to Mexico. And he came, mimicking the same words that President Trump used. He has to stop the invasion. He lauding the idea of walls, that walls would again separate us from them. And I remember that day, August 30th, was my father's birthday. And it was clear that this was going to be more of a wake than a birthday. But when it became clear that this kid was from North Texas, and he had driven there, one of the first things that popped into my mind was, has he been reading the Dallas Morning News? Did he get some of these ideas? Did we use in the headlines, maybe once too many times, the word invasion, the word surge, etc.? So I think that has made us at the Morning News and between reporters and editors have more of a healthy conversation as how do we tackle these issues? How do we, use the right language and not inspire some of these white supremacists to do a repeat of El Paso of August 3rd, 2019. So I'll leave it at that, and then look forward to your questions, and look forward to hearing John Moore and my colleague Bravo.
Thank you so much, Alfredo. Some really important points there. A couple of takeaways for me is the importance of humanizing this. And in a way, you sort of are humanizing it through your own experience. And no doubt that helps you report with sensitivity and with accuracy and with a sense of the history. And that's a really important thing that you bring to the table. The other thing that stands out to me, of course, is all the tremendous ethical issues involved in reporting on this. It's almost like a perfect storm of ethical considerations that are sort of gathered in this one concentrated area. And that's something I really hope we can get to when we get everybody together, because I'd love to hear everyone's perspective on some of those really important questions. I'd like to turn it over to John Moore, and I hear he's going to show us some photos. So looking forward to that. Thanks, John.
Very good. Let me take over the screen here so that I can. Let's see. Just 1 second. Here we go. Now, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Very good. I have been working on immigration issues off and on for 4 presidential administrations, but really more consistently in the last 10 years or so. My interest really started after I moved back to the US. I had been working abroad for 17 years of my career, most of it for the AP, and then some of it for Getty Images, where I began working in 2005. And moving back to the US, I really became very interested on the issues that I'd seen when I lived in Mexico City for 5 years and in Nicaragua for 2 years earlier in my career. And so it was very interesting for me. And really in 2010, I think many of you may remember in Arizona, they passed a highly restrictive and you could say xenophobic law called SB 1070. And that process there was where I saw xenophobia really taking hold in the US. And of course, that ultimately led to 4 years of Donald Trump in the White House. Largely in many ways on that issue. And so what I began to do is to look in Central America. As you can see, the shirt this boy has on at the funeral service for one of his classmates that was kidnapped and killed says, "The United States of America, love it or leave it." And I'm sure he had no idea what that shirt said, probably purchased in a secondhand store.
John, let me jump in for a second. We can see you, but we can't see your screen yet.
Interesting. Oh, well, that. 1 second. That. Thank you for jumping in there, because otherwise.
Well, I want to see the photos too.
Let me see.
Our tech folks are telling me that they can. Oh, we got it. Okay.
Thank you again. Thank you for jumping in. Since you haven't seen these pictures, I'll put them on very briefly. I was watching them myself. I know them very well. This is again from a memorial service for this classmate of this boy, and so I spent a lot of time back in Central America and in Mexico trying to show some of the root causes, and advise folks a little bit late that some of these pictures are difficult. This is from Acapulco, which of course we know was known for tourism for many years, and now it's also still known for tourism, especially with Mexican tourists within the country. But a lot of the international tourism dried up with the drug wars. And as you can see, funerals keep happening. Just a few weeks ago, there was a funeral in Guatemala, not this one, but another one for a group of migrants who were massacred on their way up to the U.S., I believe in January. And so it continues to happen. And part of the issues that I focus on are health issues. This boy has severe spinal issues. His father had traveled to the U.S. to work, was deported by the Border Patrol. And so not only did they not have the $6,000 they needed for that surgery, but they had incredible debt as well. And as all of us know who have looked at this issue over time, the debt that people take on in order to reach the U.S. and start a life here is, it's insane when you look at how much they make and how much they owe. I also rode on the Beast for a while, not at night. This is in Arriaga, which is in the state of Chiapas. But rode a certain part of the freight train known as the Beast, La Bestia, through Oaxaca, a safer part of that route. There's certain areas that would be impossible for me to go through. And as you can imagine, this was part of the so-called migrant caravan in October, a couple of years ago. The bridge between Guatemala and Mexico was a choke point, and there was a stampede. People were very lucky not to have been seriously injured. This photograph shows you really what it looked like after between 5,000 and 7,000 people crossed from Guatemala into southern Mexico, and they're on the road to Tapachula at this point. And I must say, of the people that embarked on that caravan, a small percentage of them actually made it. Many people came in flip-flops. They were not really prepared for the journey. It was more of an opportunity. And now I'll show a few pictures from the US-Mexico border and how this looks. This is out in Tijuana. On the Tijuana side, he's going into San Diego. And at the Tohono O'odham First Nation Reserve in Arizona, this group of fellas here is walking on the Mexican side. I was flying with a Customs and Border Protection pilot at the time. I was able to get access. And that's one thing I can talk about more later, is the access with Border Patrol and CBP in general, which has been curtailed, surprisingly, to great extent during the Biden administration. This fellow here is a vigilante with the Arizona Border Recon. They don't like to be called vigilantes, but you know, they are. I spent a lot of time, this is in Arizona, the former Tent City Jail of Sheriff Joe Arpaio, which was difficult to get access to. And this actually was more difficult here. This picture is from the exact place that became famous for kids in cages. And I should mention that this picture was taken in 2014, which was before Donald Trump's time in office. And so the chain link fencing that you see here is currently being replaced. This facility in McAllen is under, they just say it's under renovation, but I think we know what they mean by renovation is they're getting rid of the chain link and putting in plastic, which is what we've seen in the Donna facility, which is also a terrible place along the border for migrant children. I've been able to cover deportations. This was an ICE deportation, and work in Guatemala to show families being reunited, but not in a good way. Because when folks go home incurring $10,000 of debt, the homecoming may have balloons and flowers to make them feel better, but it is not a happy situation. I'll speak briefly to this picture. Yanela Sanchez, she was 2 at the time of this photograph, and I kept in touch with the family. Many of you may remember this photograph from a couple of years ago at the height of the President Trump's zero tolerance policy. And this photo became controversial because it was used by many to show child separation. I never knew that they were separated, so I didn't say so. But on social media, people are fast and free with the facts, and it was much to my relief, I found out the mother and her daughter were still together. And I kept in touch with them. I helped her get a pro bono lawyer, and she was working. Last time I was talking with her, Sandra, the mom, she was still working on their case. And now I'll just show some photographs from the last month. I've been back working on immigration issues steady now, following a year covering COVID. This is in El Paso, and I'm actually on the Ciudad Juarez side of the border. And I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post a few weeks ago addressing this issue of how the Biden administration has really cut journalists off from the kind of access that we've had under Republican and Democratic presidents for many years. And they are saying that the reason why that is happening is because of COVID, and they want to take precautions. But at the same time, I think we're all aware that when you have dozens and dozens of what they call CODELs, congressional delegations, passing through detention centers, going all along the border, it doesn't seem like a valid excuse to keep journalists out of the very same facilities. Journalists who have been covering COVID and staying safe for the last year. This photograph was just taken yesterday. The last series of pictures are as fresh as can be. I'm, as you can see, you might not be able to tell, in a hotel room at the Quality Inn in Roma, Texas, which is on the US-Mexico border. It's a little town. And people cross the river and then walk up the roads and turn themselves in, typically to Border Patrol agents, in order to apply for asylum. And trying to cover the story without any access from the government is difficult. And why is that? Because much of the federal lands are the main places where people cross in South Texas. And in South Texas, they have more border crossings than all the other sectors of the border combined. The Rio Grande Valley is by far the place where the most people come, and not just families, but also individuals trying to seek employment. This picture I was not supposed to take as well. This was under a bridge here where they have a processing center. They try to keep media out, but of course, you know, we are intrepid. We figure out a way to cover the story in one way or another. And this last series, I'll just show you quickly, was from last night. And that's the reason why, if I start rambling, you'll know, because I had what's called an all-nighter, covering people coming across the river here in Roma. The reason I was able to photograph here is because I got permission from a private landowner who was interested in the story being seen. And this is a Texas state trooper. They and Border Patrol receive people who come across. And, you know, when we talk about ethical issues, I mean, it is a real issue to photograph people who are just arriving in the country. And the way that I deal with this is that I talk to them when they're on the boat coming across. I also talk to the smugglers, the coyotes, because they want to. They think I look like a lawman, an officer of the law, and they think I'm going to puncture their dinghies. But of course, I'm not going to do that. And so I talk to people on their way over, and try to make them feel comfortable that we're trying to tell their story and giving them the opportunity to not be photographed if that's what they want. But you know, to be honest, after a month of hard road, when folks arrive on U.S. You can say U.S. shores there on the Rio Grande, the bank of the Rio Grande, they are happy to talk. They're relieved. It's a weight. They've been just, you know, everyone, when you talk to people, I say, give me some details. What was the toughest part of your journey? And so many people just say, Mexico. The length of the country for them is a nightmare coming across, because they're preyed upon so many people on their way up. And many were very happy to see me and tell me a little bit about what they saw. And I will relinquish my control of the screen. Thank you. There we go.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, John. Lots of things to think about. You know, struck again, as always, by the emotional power of photographs and that sort of immediacy that people who can only use words like me, you know, are constantly struggling to convey, and you do it so skillfully, and also challenges, physical challenges. I mean, the kind of risks that no doubt calculated risks, but risks nonetheless, that you take to get this kind of information out into the public sphere, you know, is admirable. And the whole issue of access, would be delighted to talk more about that, because it is a bit of a paradox that you would of course expect Biden to be more press friendly than Trump was, but in some cases that's not really happening. Next up, I'd like to hand over the microphone to Cal Sirenio. Welcome. And thank you so much for joining us.
Tani gondo risakundo na shini kibibitin da to do agusha na ke ganyo kwa. Thank you so much. Pues muchas gracias.
Thank you so much. I just spoke in Tunsavi, my mother tongue, to all of you in this panel talking about migration in the northern border. I would like to share with you my experience as a journalist covering migration in the border between Ciudad Juárez, Tijuana, and the United States, the geographical situation and condition of Mexico as a country of transit of immigrants. Journalists have to modify the language continuously in order to not affect the rights of immigrants to move due to political, economic, and social conditions in their countries of origin. As a journalist, I can identify with immigrants not because I was an undocumented immigrant, but because I am a permanent immigrant in this country, because I am from an indigenous community in Guerrero. Now I live in Mexico City, where I moved to coverage in the border. So all this has helped me understand and seek new ways to tell a story. Because probably one of the challenges, the greatest challenges in my case, I face when trying to tell this story has to do with cultural and language aspects. As you know, at the beginning of my presentation, I began speaking in my mother tongue. So there are immigrants who have a different cultural context, both Mexicans and from Guatemala. And so when they arrive at the border, whether their intention is to cross to the United States with a visa or as an irregular migrant, they face this cultural and language process of difficulties because there are no interpreters who can translate their mother tongue. So this is one of the problems immigrants face, but also as a journalist, I face this conflict because often the story of this culture and this language is unknown by journalists. So stigmatization and stereotypes are reproduced toward immigrants. So what we need to address is how to use language without violating human rights, without stigmatizing immigrants, because this is a constant problem that appears in Mexican media. And the first thing we notice in journals such as La Jornada, El Universal, and Reforma is journalists talk about immigrants, but nobody talks about what happened to this person, what are the causes that drove them to leave their families and communities in order to travel to the United States. This is where the other story, the untold story, is. When we are in contact with this other reality, academic people can do it, but they do it from a perspective of social and cultural sciences. But they need to accompany this process with the real situation of these migrants. For example, in the case of the state of Guerrero, where there is a lot of violence, political and social violence, which has forced lots of immigrants to await a process in Tijuana in order to obtain political asylum due to the violence in their state. Most of them are from indigenous communities who require an interpreter but do not have it. Another part of the population comes from the Sierra, from the mountains in Guerrero, and they do not speak fluid Spanish that can be understood in order for us to understand the phenomenon in that area. Arriving in Tijuana, we read about immigrants in the 17 organized refugee shelters. They only talk about immigrants, but there's nobody talking about the story behind them. And the problem is that the journalist is just a public teller of the story. He merely gathers information, counts the number of migrants, the number of shelters, and so he becomes or she becomes a recorder, a systematic recorder of the migrating population. But nobody is talking about the reality behind this phenomenon, the causes. So this is where we need to change the narrative. We need to begin to explain the causes of this phenomenon in countries. I'm talking about the case of Guerrero, but throughout Mexico, there are 3 states which are considered highly marginalized, which are Guerrero, Oaxaca, and Chiapas. And curiously, these are these states with the highest number of migration towards the United States and Canada. But nobody is talking about the causes that have drove them to leave their countries. On the other hand, the journalist must change his or her language to be very sensitive to how to approach the story and the process without turning into a part of the story. This is the dilemma. As journalists, we many times become part of the story and we lose track of what we really want to say. He also might become an observer who is there observing what is happening, but he or she does not consider another way of telling the story. So here in the paper I write right now about migration has dedicated exclusively to talk about social and human rights topics. And an essential part of it is migration, because as I mentioned in the beginning, Mexico is a country of origin, a country, a destiny country, and a transit country. So we need to consider this process, and we need to talk about it from a focus of human dignity and of inclusion. Therefore, we are trying to understand in Pie de Página as a digital site, we're trying to understand what is happening, why these people are deciding to move, and we are also telling the story of what happens beyond the immigrants, especially now during the pandemic. We were able to talk to this migrant people by telephone and to talk to them about what was going on. So we managed to report this for most of the immigrants who died in Chicago and New York were Mexican, and many of them did not have an access to health health support, so they died abandoned. So of course, this is a matter of concern to all of us, and it should guide us to look for new alternatives and new ways of providing and creating these stories without it becoming something scandalous or just merely accounting the numbers, but a story of the lives of each one of the immigrants who has abandoned his or her country in looking for a better way of life and not finding it. This is a constant struggle in which we must change the narrative and create a new language to address immigrants.
Thank you so much. Kao, you really bring up some important things for us to think about because of the diversity of people coming up from Mexico is something that I think gets lost very often in translation, that we at least on the US side of the border, it's sort of like the story, I think a lot of times for an average reader or an average person in the United States, the immigrant story begins when they cross the border. But from what we've been hearing, not only from you, but from some of our other panelists today, it is part of a very long story that that needs to be told so that we can understand that part that we're most familiar with, which is when they actually do cross the border and attempt to come into this country. I think we have lots of questions, and there's one that I've seen come up a few times in the thread, and also sort of intersects with ethics, and it would be a question for everybody, and that is just how do we I think the question is in the context of photographs, of taking pictures of people. How do you protect the people that you photographed? You know, when we're writing stories, we can well, I guess you can hide someone's face, but how do you handle that? There seem to be opposing forces in journalism where, one, we push for more revelation, revealing more information, but sometimes ethics kind of pushes us towards, you know, this idea of protecting the people that we cover. How do you balance those opposing forces in your coverage when you are dealing with such vulnerable populations? And anybody can jump in.
Well, just speaking to pictures, just briefly, you know, I try to let people know that I'm not law enforcement, number one, because naturally, when you're there in a position like this, people are going to automatically think I'm a police officer, and I try to make very clear that I'm not. Often, you know, in terms of I'm not writing stories, I'm doing captions, right? So I don't use names. I'll use perhaps first names. Usually I'll use a country of origin and age, and sometimes first names. Oftentimes people are masked right now because of the pandemic. And, you know, I try not to, I don't say where they're going to. And you know, and the whole issue of talking about why people come, I totally agree. We have to provide that to give context to why people are leaving. Sometimes some folks are leaving for reasons they don't want to talk about, and very personal reasons because they've experienced violence, perhaps sexual violence or gang violence. And there's a lot of folks who just say, I don't feel comfortable talking about that. And so there's that too. That sometimes gives me pause to feel like I'm prying. When I'm just writing a caption, that's the thing. If I can't get into the meat of a story, do I really want to put in a caption that someone's fleeing from sexual violence? It seems you know, unfair, even if they're offering that information.
Right.
I mean, I have to admit, I struggle with that a lot because oftentimes I do not have a photographer next to me. And so I'm left to take my own pictures. Oftentimes you're targeting people who are extremely vulnerable. I mean, they just crossed the country. They're very disoriented. And what I try to do when it's possible is especially if I'm taking pictures that involve children, I will show the picture to the family. And I'll say, you know, están cómodos? I mean, how do you feel about this photo? At times I also feel like I have to, in a way, play editor on the spot because, you know, you're talking to them and you have to remind them that, you know, like John said, I mean, I have to remind them that I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an immigrant rights activist, I'm a journalist, and that what I write will get picked up in other places. So I want to make sure that that's clear to them. And because at times, you know, they will give you all of their documents. They will give you their birth certificate, etc. And so I have to, at the moment, you know, make a decision and try not to use all that information. Maybe a first name, maybe a middle name. There was an example recently where we writing a story about immigrants who were falling off the wall and they were injured, and the Border Patrol picked them up. The immigrants said, you know, we told them we were injured, and they still just deported us back to Mexico. And you know, it's a serious charge. So I went to the Border Patrol, and they kept, you know, saying, we're not going to even look into this unless we have names, unless we have ages, etc. So I had to go back to the albergue, the shelter, and explain that to the immigrants and explain that to the people at the shelter. But the immigrants themselves felt so compelled, you know, that this was happening, that they insisted that I use their names, their ages, that I used the day that they crossed and the time. And so we had to go back to the Border Patrol with all that information. At that point, the editors decided, you know, we're going to use their full names. And they were aware of that. And, you know, the immigrants were, I mean, again, they just felt that it was such a need to use all that information. But that's one of the rare instances where we will do that. I mean, again, they've been to hell and back, and the last thing I want to do as a journalist is make their journey even that much more difficult. Yeah, so I mean, like John, I mean, sometimes the less I use in the story, the more comfortable I feel. And then there have been times when the parent will say, I don't want my kid's picture, and I'll talk to my editor, you know, back in Dallas, you know, can you guys blur this out or even use the picture from another angle? But that's a moment when I really miss a photojournalist next to me. You know, because I mean, you're dealing with trying to get all this information, and then something you also have to deal with the photography aspect. So, John, please come back to the border and let me know when you're here.
Thank you. You know, that hobbles me also in getting a fuller story is because the pictures are there and they disappear, right? And so while I'm trying to chat someone up for a while, they're just happening right in front of my peripheral vision, and so you have to make some hard choices sometimes on what's most important. We also have the same issue with video, right? If you're shooting video and you miss your stills, I mean, and that's more the case actually at newspapers now than agencies. Newspaper photographers have to do it all. I feel very bad for them. They have to tweet in real time. It's tough times.
Yeah. Dr. Silvia, what's your impression, just from your sociological impression from what you're hearing, and how does it fit in with some of your work?
Well, let me tell you that the images were just absolutely compelling. But there is a continuity in time. I mean, you can see this picture since how many years ago? And we have not been able to push forward a way to make the situation more, ¿cómo voy a pasar al español? El tema de cómo se construye la
how to build and create a positive sensibility. Because human suffering is also used by lobbyists, anti-immigrants, and they are saying we need to stop this.
I don't know if that can be understood. The tougher the measures, and you've seen it. Donald Trump said, we have been very successful because we have less people trying to come in. You know what I mean? If you see the case of Israel and the Palestinian territories, the huge walls have truly reduced terrorist attacks. You know what I mean? So it's a kind of a tricky situation that we have not been able to, I mean, it is so complex that I think that it needs to come with a narrative that also tells the huge success after suffering that needs to be communicated at the same level. All the stories of success of migrants are hardly ever told. Why is that? I don't know. I have all this complexity moving in my head. You know what I mean? And something that it is always very striking for me, most of the images that have been produced are on the US-Mexico border, but some of the comments of the real actors crossing Mexico that recognize that the big danger is within Mexico. We see the railroad, but we need also more focusing on the tragedy inside Mexico, the tragedy that lies within Mexico, not only for foreigners that transit into Mexico, but the tragedy of Mexicans living in such a dangerous country. I don't know if I'm very, very politically incorrect, but it needs to come together. It needs to come together because, I mean, it's not a matter that crosses only through the channels of government's agreements, but on the side of civil society coming together to understand that migration. Let me go to Spanish again. Si la migración,
if migration continues to be undocumented and is a great business, then we see that this is the critical aspect of globalization, where we need to turn immigration into the great success and the possibility of a positive globalization.
The possibility of huge success. Por ejemplo, Italia. Doy un caso interesantísimo.
For example, Italy is a very interesting case. The Albanese were the ones who suffered the images arriving in Italy.
Nobody talks about the Albanians any longer. Now, the non-positive immigrants are coming from somewhere else. And they told me, we are okay because now that we are successful, the story goes beyond to another group. This has happened in America. Italians, the mafia, now they are so successful. Americans admire Italians. So there will come a time when they need to admire Mexican and Central Americans. But let's go on the right track to bring this two dialogues together, success and suffering. And how can they communicate? How can the suffering be lessened? How can we protect them? Let's work with the ones who have been already very successful. I don't know if I try to explain myself kind of complicated.
I think that's is a very smart explanation. And you know something interesting. Where I live in Connecticut, about Stamford, Connecticut's about an hour outside of New York City, and we have a very large Guatemalan population. And I spent a lot of time in that community photographing different activities, English as second language, all sorts of different programs. And I work for a wire service, right? I don't work for a newspaper, so I can't actually publish the pictures. I can provide them to all of our subscribers, but they actually have to publish them. And the quantity of pictures that get published of all those types of things that I photograph is so small compared to the tough stuff. And I still try, but people are editors, the public, whoever, seems to be more interested in the difficult topics. And that's a big, wide discussion. And goodness, how do we solve that?
Yeah, it's also deals with ethics also.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I went through the same thing with Associated Press. A happy story, you know, unless the story is moving around Christmas time or something like that, you know, editors are not going to be very terribly excited about it. And even if it gets out on the wire, it's the one that you get the fewest clips on, where if you have some great tragedy to report on, then that's the stuff that gets the attention.
I mean, I was going to say, Joseph, I mean, my dream story for the last 20 years has been, you know, to do a feature story on the best burrito on the border.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the best burrito in either Juarez or El Paso. And
I want to read that story immediately.
Yeah,
that would be a huge hit.
There's always the next humanitarian crisis to cover, and that's always going to get more attention.
But that would be take a few photos and put it on you put it on Instagram, and you know you'll go viral. But I mean, the question, and this gets back to a question from our audience, which was specifically aimed at Alfredo, but I'll just give it, I'll sort of rephrase it a little bit for everybody. And the question for Alfredo was, since you are so intimately connected with this story through your own personal history, do you feel that does it somehow erode your ability to be objective in kind of like the journalistic sense? And I'd like to give Alfredo a chance to respond to that, but also sort of ask, you know, everyone else on the panel. I mean, it raises the question, are our stories about immigration aimed at affecting a certain type of effect? Is it ethical to try to change policy through your work, or to make people more look at immigrants more favorably through your work? Is that just sort of like a basic human ethic, or is it something that somehow infringes on journalistic objectivity and our ability to I guess get the widest audience possible and speak to all corners of society?
I mean, I have to admit that the question didn't really register, didn't really hit me until I started working as a journalist. When other people sort of brought it up, you know, are you the best person to tell the story when you're an immigrant? And I felt that was it's always been very important for me to be transparent. I mean, these days anyone can do a Google search and know that, you know, I was a farm worker and I was an immigrant. And it was actually while as a farm worker that the idea first came about, you know, wouldn't it be neat to be a journalist? And I remember I was working out in the fields, a TV crew came out to interview kids see what it was like to work in the fields without a break, without bad sanitation conditions, etc. And I just thought, wow, these people took time to want to know what I thought. But I've always seen that background, that history as a benefit, as something, que te fortalece más. I mean, it helps you more, not only to have empathy and a richer understanding of what you're covering, but I think it also challenges me to make sure that I get all sides to the story, to make sure that I talk to, especially these days, when again it's so divisive and there's so much xenophobia. I mean, anytime I do an immigration story, I know that my email is just going to be, packed, and the same thing, go back to Mexico, etc. So, but I think it challenges me in a very personal way, in a very professional way, to make sure that I'm covering all angles. So, I mean, that's really the way I see it.
Kyle, I had a question, a related question for you, Kyle, and that is, how do you, as someone who's writing for a very specific community in an indigenous language, how do you view this idea of objectivity in this kind of this sense that that our stories should not necessarily be aimed at affecting a particular response or being favorable to one community over the other, when you work for an organization that is really sort of aimed at supporting a specific community?
Sí, eso uno de los problemas que
Yes. One of the main problems as a journalist, and I think we share it, is that we often seek sensationalist information instead of looking for information that might help change the face of immigration. Because this is more popular, you can get more readers, among other benefits. And I have just read a question where they ask me why we do not speak of internal immigration. Actually, inside Mexico, there is a large number of immigrants. We should remember that with the crisis of 1994, after signing the NAFTA treaty, the phenomenon known as from rural areas to the city, many agricultural workers left the countryside towards the cities. But after the crisis of 1994, where we had a serious economical crisis and many factories were closed, the factory workers in the cities were unemployed. And then we had another phenomenon, a different one, from the city to the countryside. And I've had the opportunity to interview people in Baja California and Sonora, and I found those who used to be factory workers now working in the countryside. But these stories are not being told. I don't see academic members working on or researching this phenomenon of internal immigration in the country. So the problem is that if we do not analyze the situation from a journalistic point of view and academic point of view, I believe it will be very difficult to tell the story of transnational migrants, because right now we are facing this transnational phenomenon because we arrive in the United States and we find immigrants from all around the world. In Tijuana, we have the Central and South American immigrants, also those from Asia, but those stories are not being told. We are not seeing the face of these people. So I believe we have to understand why immigrants, irregular migrants in the United States who work in the country, such as the Central Valley of California, the Peninsula of Florida, the workers in Arkansas or in Washington who work in really poor conditions and without any health help. However, there is another phenomenon that is not being analyzed, and that is the phenomenon of migrants with an H-2A visa, who are the ones who face one of the biggest problems in the United States, because they practically live in prisoner conditions, under the threat that if you do not do what you agreed, if you don't fulfill this agreement, you will not have the opportunity to return here. So as I mentioned in the beginning, one of the problems of these migrant communities is a language communication. So if they don't have a formal interpreter or a way to understand what they are being told, their life conditions are really, really poor. So we have this phenomenon that as journalists, we are not attending. And as academics, I do not see that work being done. In the United States, there are agencies who have allegedly researched immigrant lives, those with H-2A visas. However, the only story I've seen is the phone report, which is what they call it, of a work harassment situation, but there's not really a story behind this migrant people. So I always insist on, why is he there? What are the causes that led him to move over there? And the reason is that salaries in Mexico cannot allow the children of country people to even feed their families. So I believe there is very little attention on this subject, and we as journalists and academics have to begin to consider immigration from a human rights perspective.
Yo nada más quisiera señalar una cosa.
I would only like to mention something that is absent in our discussion, and that is the fact that throughout the press and social media, everybody talks about the fight against drug trafficking, but we really have to explore closely the topic of the persecution of human traffickers and human smugglers at an international level. I believe this is a subject that is really absent, and there is no follow-up of any of these gangs. They talk about it as a business related to drug trafficking, but we should really know how many arrests have been made in Mexico, how many in the United States, what are the policies at a regional or continental level in order to fight against this cancer, which is an international business, very profitable business. And I believe there should also be stories of persecution of these sort of facts. And I don't see where those issues are being addressed. And secondly, should we think about finding a formula to penalize or not permit parents to use minors for their own means, with all appealing to the international sensibility towards children, when in many occasions those who are behind these cases are the parents who use their children as human shields. And I believe this is also a big topic which should be explored in order to discover the urban reality today. The children who are asking for money in the corners of the streets, they are a real army. And where are the adults? Where are the parents who are in a certain way those who force them and expose them to all this suffering and conditions? I believe that this is a joint participation. And when we talk about coyotes or drug trafficking, we must also consider the parents. And I agree totally. This would be a great story that we need to explore further. The role of, how has the role of the coyote changed today than it was decades ago?
And Alfredo, didn't you do a story recently about
the story I did was about just how sophisticated these groups have become just over the, even in the last couple of years, and how it's oftentimes the smugglers who will talk the parents into taking their kids, because the smugglers, I mean, they're so sophisticated about U.S. policy that they will look for any little breakthrough, any little sign, and they will, I mean, just what we're seeing these days, when President Biden said we're not sending back the children or teens, you saw the big influx of that happening. And it's, I mean, I agree with Dr. Silvia. I mean, it's something that we have to do much, take a much deeper look.
Exactly.
But again, the story is, it's so fluid and it changes day to day. Believe it or not, but that's on my list of to-do stories.
Let's do it together then.
Get back to Central America and try to explore that more.
John, in some of your work, I mean, what has been, you mentioned it, you alluded to it a little bit earlier about talking to some of these traffickers, to the coyotes. How does that angle sort of figure into your work, logistically or otherwise?
Well, it's interesting. Usually I have no access to coyotes. I've been, photographing border crossings for a long time, and it's very rare to get pictures of people coming across in rafts, because the spotters that the traffickers have along the Mexican side of the border are very talented. They're there all day long, and their sole job is to see me on the other side. And their bosses are not very forgiving if they don't do their job very well. So I can arrive and I can be very quiet. I can be behind a tree. They're gonna see me, and so it's a challenge to get those pictures. But right now, what's happening in this one place in Roma, Texas, is where the landowner is given permission. The coyotes have become acclimated to photographers. And in fact, they'll ask us, are there any troopers with you? Because last week, one of the state troopers went rogue, and he jumped out of the darkness and knifed this guy's raft, freaking everyone out. And it was not an official. I mean, he was taken out and not put back there again, because either law enforcement has to stop people or they have to let them through. But if it's in the middle, then people drowned, and it's really dangerous. And so the coyotes are very concerned that the journalist embedded within the journalists might be a bad, in their mind, a bad actor. And so it's interesting. I've not been able to photograph the pictures that you saw from last night. For my career, quite rare, because I rarely get to see that. And in fact, you saw how they were lit. I brought a whole light system down with me, because otherwise photojournalists are we have to follow the TV cameramen around with their light, and there's nothing more pathetic than that. So I brought my own lights and light it up a little bit.
Okay, great. Kyle, was there something you wanted to add to that? We can't hear you. You're muted.
Bueno, listo. Hablando de más sobre
Well,
coyote.
Speaking about these smugglers and coyotes, as Dr. Sylvia mentions, this is a world phenomenon that is rarely being addressed. And we often talk about smugglers who take migrants from the south, from Chiapas towards the border, the US border, but we talk very little about these coyotes who traffic immigrants in the United States. And I have a story that which I lived when I traveled towards Washington. In Los Angeles, by chance or due to bad luck, I traveled next to a coyote, and this was because he didn't know, I didn't know what the transportation means from LA to Washington. So I arrived and bought my ticket, but somebody told me it was better to take a ride on the road. And the person who took me was a coyote who has a security house in LA, where we were taken, and then we traveled towards Washington. And what I discovered from that journey is that that network of coyotes and smugglers are connected because they spoke on the phone about with their contacts in Chicago, in New York, in Arkansas, in Florida, in lots of parts of the United States. They had someone who was moving migrant. It is not my intention to uncover immigrants traveling inside the United States. But what I'm trying to set on the table is how these coyotes abuse of their conditions in order to obtain more financial resources when moving immigrants. And I say this because an immigrant from Guatemala, who they took from Los Angeles toward Seattle, the initial proposal was that they were going to charge him $150. When we arrived at Seattle, the cost of that coyote was $500 for the journey. And there was a death threat towards the family in Guatemala if they did not pay this $500. And this concerns me and worries me very much, because sometimes we have the impression that we Mexicans are the coyotes in the border. However, that network of smugglers inside the United States are not being investigated. Just like Dr. Sylvia says, we haven't heard of a network of smugglers that has fallen and was sanctioned, neither in the United States nor in Mexico. We do not see this research toward this group. So this is a problem that is not being addressed, and journalists are not talking about it. They know little about this because especially the journalist who is interested in some type of journalism, they're looking for a coyote in Sonora, in Mexicali, or in Ciudad Juarez to seeking an experience in the South. But nobody is trying to tell a story about what is happening inside the United States. So I believe this is where we need to begin working, because our intention is not to favor the free transit of immigrants within the country, but so that the aim is that immigrants are not threatened and hurt during their journeys.
Unbelievably, we've run out of time. So I could stay here all day. I don't know about you guys, but we haven't even scratched the surface here. But thank you so much, and I'm going to hand this over to Claudia Villegas, who is going to close out the session.
Muchísimas gracias, Joe.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you, Dr. Silvia Núñez, John Moore, Alfredo Corchado, Clau Sirenio. It has been incredible to hear you today, this morning. The financial press says that with COVID, globalization is in crisis and it was being tested. Immigration journalism tells us that the globalization has not affected the mobilization of people with all the problems this means. Thank you so much for your participations. They have been amazing. And to our audience, we remind you to use the hashtags report in the border, reportando la frontera, EU-UNAM21. Let's make this discussion viral. We'll return in 20 minutes to receive the third and last panel. Thank you so much. Thank you.
El tema que abordo es el tema migratorio.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best.
Already started discussing these issues with the president of Mexico.
Se ofreció de que iba a haber esa reforma migratoria y no la llevaron a
They're
cabo.
sending people that have lots of problems.